At 11:15 a.m. on April 9, 1944, Lieutenant Commander George Castleman stood on the bridge of the destroyer escort USS Pillsbury and watched a German submarine break the surface only 700 yards off his starboard bow. For 10 months, he had commanded the ship. During that time, Pillsbury had hunted submarines across the Atlantic, launched dozens of depth charge attacks, and driven countless enemy boats away. But they had never captured one. No one had. The submarine rising from the Atlantic that morning was U-515, commanded by one of Germany's most feared submarine aces, Werner Henke. Henke had already sunk 25 Allied ships. Hundreds of sailors and passengers had died in those attacks. In December 1942 alone, Henke's torpedoes destroyed the British troopship Ceramic, killing more than 600 people. Now his submarine was crippled. For hours, Pillsbury and several sister ships had hammered the boat with depth charges. The pressure damage forced it to the surface. The moment U-515 broke through the waves, chaos erupted. German sailors scrambled onto the deck. Some ran to man the anti-aircraft guns. Others simply jumped into the Atlantic. Castleman didn't hesitate. Open fire. Pillsbury's guns erupted. Nearby, USS Flaherty joined in. Machine gun fire ripped across the submarine's conning tower. Aircraft circling overhead strafed the deck with rockets and .50 caliber guns. Within minutes, the fight was over. The submarine's bow lifted upward, almost pointing toward the sky. Water rushed through her open hatches. Then U-515 slid backward into the Atlantic and disappeared. 44 German sailors were pulled from the water. Among them was Henke himself. For the destroyer crews, it looked like a clear victory. Another German submarine destroyed. Another threat removed from the shipping lanes. But Captain Daniel Gallery, commander of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal and the entire hunter-killer task group, saw something very different. He saw a missed opportunity. Gallery had watched the submarine remain afloat for nearly 10 minutes before sinking. 10 minutes. In that time, his ships had done exactly what they had been trained to do. They had destroyed the enemy. But Gallery realized something unsettling. If he had been ready, if he had trained his sailors beforehand, those 10 minutes might have been enough to capture the submarine instead of sinking it. The intelligence value would have been extraordinary. German Enigma encryption machines, naval codebooks, advanced torpedo technology, acoustic homing systems, all of it hidden inside those submarines. For years, Allied intelligence had struggled to break German naval communications. Capturing a submarine intact could reveal secrets that might shorten the war. But there was one enormous problem. The United States Navy had not captured an enemy warship at sea since 1815, the War of 1812. More than a century earlier, modern naval warfare had no place for boarding actions. Sailors were not trained for them. No procedures existed. No manuals explained how to do it. The idea simply didn't belong in 20th century naval combat. Gallery decided that had to change. The challenge was enormous. German submarine crews were trained to destroy their own boats rather than allow capture. The moment a submarine surfaced under attack, the captain would order scuttling procedures. Sea valves would be opened to flood the engine rooms. Demolition charges would be armed throughout the vessel. Codebooks would be destroyed. Sensitive equipment smashed. The entire process could take only a few minutes. Even if American sailors reached a submarine, they would be boarding a vessel that was already sinking and possibly rigged to explode. And the statistics made the idea even more dangerous. In 1943 alone, German submarines had sunk more than 300 Allied merchant ships. Destroyer escorts like Pillsbury hunted them under a simple rule. Find the submarine. Destroy it before it destroys you. There was no time for experiments. No margin for hesitation. Every second a submarine remained afloat was another second it could launch torpedoes. Pillsbury herself was an Everts-class destroyer escort, a compact warship of roughly 1,200 tons, armed with 3-inch guns, depth charges, and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. She had been built for one purpose: to kill submarines, not capture them. But Gallery had already made his decision. Every ship in Task Group 22-3 would create a boarding party. They would train. They would prepare. And during their next patrol, they would attempt something the U.S. Navy had not tried in 129 years. They would capture a German submarine alive. The task group returned to Norfolk later that month. On board Pillsbury, Castleman assembled the sailors he trusted most. He told them their next mission would be unlike anything the Navy had ever attempted. They were going to board a German submarine, and they had 6 weeks to figure out how. On May 15, 1944, Pillsbury sailed again from Norfolk. Officially, the orders described another routine anti-submarine patrol. But Captain Gallery carried secret authorization from the highest levels of naval command. His instructions were simple: bring one back alive. Pillsbury's boarding party consisted of 8 men. Their leader was Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David. David was 41 years old, older than most officers aboard the ship. He had spent 25 years in the Navy, starting as an enlisted sailor and working his way up through the ranks. He served as the ship's assistant engineering officer. He understood machinery, pipes, valves, the complicated systems that kept ships afloat. Those skills would be critical, because David and his team would be entering a submarine that was actively trying to sink itself. Training began almost immediately after Pillsbury left Norfolk. Every day, David drilled his men on the ship's fantail. They practiced climbing over rails and ladders. They rehearsed jumping from small whaleboats onto a moving deck. They studied intelligence photographs and technical drawings of the German Type 9 submarine, memorizing its layout as best they could. But the problems were staggering. A damaged submarine might circle wildly at the surface, its rudder jammed by depth-charge blasts. The deck would be slick with seawater and fuel oil. German sailors might still be aboard, armed and desperate, and the submarine could dive again at any moment, dragging the boarding party down with it. Worst of all were the demolition charges. German captains followed strict scuttling protocols. Explosive charges placed throughout the submarine could destroy the vessel within minutes. At the same time, sea valves would be opened to flood the engine rooms and control compartments. David's team estimated they might have 3 to 5 minutes after boarding before catastrophic flooding made the submarine impossible to save. In that tiny window, they would have to locate demolition charges, disarm them, close the flooding valves, secure the vessel, all while navigating the cramped, unfamiliar interior of a foreign submarine in near darkness. Their equipment was basic: flashlights, wrenches, sidearms. There was no specialized gear for capturing enemy submarines, because no one had ever needed it before. During the long voyage south, Captain Gallery held repeated conferences with his destroyer escort commanders. The new strategy required extreme restraint. Once a submarine surfaced, ships would fire only small-caliber weapons, just enough to drive the German crew into the water. Aircraft would strafe the deck to prevent the enemy from manning their guns, but pilots were ordered to avoid hits below the waterline. The goal was not to sink the submarine. The goal was to wound it, and then board it. Pillsbury's role would be critical. The moment a submarine surfaced, Castleman's crew would launch their whaleboat. David and his boarding team would race toward the drifting submarine. They would climb aboard, and they would try to save it before it sank. If they were even 30 seconds too slow, the submarine would flood beneath them, and the boarding party would vanish with it. The task group sailed south toward the Cape Verde Islands, off the west coast of Africa. Guadalcanal's aircraft flew constant patrols, searching the ocean for periscopes or snorkels. Day after day passed with no contact. The crew grew restless. David continued drilling his boarding party. They rehearsed every scenario, memorized every step, and waited. Then on the morning of June 4th, 1944, everything changed. At 11:09 a.m., the sonar operator aboard USS Chatelaine reported a contact. Bearing 045 degrees. Range 800 yards. A submarine was running submerged, directly toward the escort carrier Guadalcanal. David's team had trained for 6 weeks. Now they had only minutes. Chatelaine turned sharply and accelerated toward the contact. Above them, 2 Wildcat fighters from Guadalcanal dove toward the water. Their pilots spotted the dark shape of a submarine moving just below the surface. Machine guns opened fire, stitching long lines of spray across the ocean to mark the target for the destroyers. At 11:16, Chatelaine released her first pattern of depth charges. The explosions hurled towering white columns of water into the sky, and seconds later, something else appeared on the surface. Oil. The submarine was rising. The submarine was hit. Just 6.5 minutes after the first depth charges exploded, The German U-boat burst through the surface 700 yards from USS Chatelaine. She came up bow first, gray steel streaming seawater. The explosions had crippled her. Her rudder was jammed, her electrical systems dead. Seawater poured through cracked pipes in the engine room. Unable to steer, the submarine began circling slowly to starboard, moving at 5 or 6 knots like a wounded animal. Hatches burst open. German sailors scrambled onto the deck. Some tried to reach the submarine's deck guns. They never got the chance. Destroyer escorts surrounding the boat opened fire immediately. Machine gun bullets sparked against the conning tower. One German sailor collapsed on the deck. The rest raised their hands and began jumping into the Atlantic. Within seconds, the submarine's crew was abandoning ship. On the bridge of USS Pillsbury, Lieutenant Commander Castleman watched the circling submarine carefully. This was the moment they had trained for. He gave the order, "Lower the whaleboat." Lieutenant Albert David and his 8-man boarding party were already waiting. They dropped into the small boat and cast off instantly, the coxswain steering directly toward the drifting submarine. But the U-boat was still moving, still circling. The whaleboat had to intercept it like hunters chasing a wounded animal. Oil spread across the water from ruptured tanks. German sailors thrashed nearby, shouting for rescue. David ignored them. His focus never left the submarine. The gray hull grew larger every second. Finally, the whaleboat pulled alongside. The steel surface was slick with oil and seawater. David grabbed a railing and hauled himself onto the deck. His men followed close behind. Beneath their boots, the submarine rolled and shuddered. It was still flooding. One German body lay motionless near the conning tower hatch. No other crew remained aboard. Without hesitation, David climbed down the ladder into the submarine. The control room was almost dark. Emergency lights cast a dim red glow across unfamiliar machinery. Broken pipes sprayed water across the compartment. The deck tilted slightly beneath his feet. The submarine was sinking. Somewhere below, he could hear the rush of seawater. The Germans had opened the sea valves before abandoning the boat. David knew the timeline. 3 minutes, maybe 5. After that, the submarine would be lost. His team spread quickly through the compartments. One sailor located a sea strainer valve, a large pipe designed to flood the bilge compartments. The cover had been removed and thrown aside. He found it nearby, screwed it back into place, and slowed the flooding. Other men searched for demolition charges. They found them everywhere. The Germans had planted explosives throughout the submarine: engine rooms, torpedo compartments, control spaces. In total, they located 13 charges. Each one had to be examined and disarmed. Some timers were already running. The men worked in darkness, wading through oily water while tracing cables and pipes they had never seen before. They pulled wires, removed detonators, closed valves, sealed hatches. Slowly, the flooding began to slow. But above them, a new danger appeared. The damaged submarine continued circling helplessly on the surface. Without steering control, she swung dangerously toward USS Pillsbury. Castleman had to maneuver quickly to avoid collision. In the chaos, the whaleboat that had delivered David's team was crushed between the two hulls. 3 compartments aboard Pillsbury flooded from the impact. But the boarding party remained aboard the submarine, and the submarine itself was still afloat. They had stopped the scuttling. At 11:30 a.m., a second boarding team arrived from the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, led by Commander Earl Trocino, the carrier's chief engineer. He found David's men still working in flooded compartments, still disarming demolition charges hidden deep inside the submarine. The Americans had done something no U.S. sailors had accomplished in over a century. They had captured a German submarine. Now they had to keep it from sinking. Commander Trocino immediately took charge of the salvage effort. Before the war, he had worked as a merchant marine engineer, experienced with ship machinery. But even he had never seen the inside of a German submarine. The Type 9 U-boat was larger than expected, more than 250 feet long, divided into 11 watertight compartments. The design was unfamiliar. Labels were written in German. Equipment was arranged differently than on American ships. Trocino crawled through the flooded compartments, tracing pipes by hand through oily bilge water until he understood how the submarine's systems worked. The stern was already partially underwater. Depth charge damage had ruptured pipes and tanks throughout the aft section. Water seeped in through dozens of leaks. If the flooding could not be controlled, the submarine would sink within hours. Trocino organized the salvage effort. He directed sailors to close specific valves. He identified pumps that still worked. He improvised connections between compartments to redirect water flow. Slowly, the flooding stabilized. While Trocino fought to keep the submarine afloat, David's team searched for intelligence material. What they found was extraordinary. 2 Enigma cipher machines, complete with coding rotors. Stacks of German naval codebooks. Signal logs. Operational orders. Charts showing U-boat patrol zones across the Atlantic. In total, they recovered nearly 900 pounds of classified German documents. 4 Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park in Britain. The discovery was priceless. For years, they had struggled to break German naval communications. Fresh codebooks and intact encryption machines could unlock months of intercepted messages. But the surprises continued. In the forward torpedo room, the salvage team discovered something even more dangerous. 2 experimental acoustic homing torpedoes. The Germans called them Zonkenig. Unlike ordinary torpedoes, these weapons could track sound, homing in on the propeller noise of Allied ships. Understanding how they worked could save countless lives. But Captain Daniel Gallery now faced a serious problem. His task group had just captured a German submarine 150 miles off the African coast. The submarine could not move under its own power, and nearly 3,000 American sailors had witnessed the capture. If Germany discovered that U-505 had been taken intact, they would immediately change their naval codes. Every advantage gained from the captured materials would vanish overnight. Gallery ordered absolute secrecy. No radio transmissions describing the capture. No written mention in ship logs. The 58 German prisoners, including their wounded captain, were confined below decks aboard Guadalcanal and forbidden from speaking to anyone. Then a new order arrived from Washington. Originally, the submarine was supposed to be towed to Casablanca. Now it would be taken to Bermuda instead, more than 2,500 miles across the Atlantic. The timing could not have been more critical. Allied forces were preparing to invade Normandy. If Germany learned their naval codes were compromised just days before D-Day, the consequences could be catastrophic. Pillsbury tried first to tow the submarine, but the earlier collision had damaged her hull and flooded several compartments. She could not hold the strain. Instead, USS Guadalcanal rigged a tow line from the aircraft carrier itself. The slow journey north began. For 15 days, salvage crews remained aboard the captured submarine around the clock, pumping water and monitoring leaks while storms threatened to swamp the fragile vessel. Eventually, the fleet tug USS Abnaki took over towing duties. On June 19, 1944, the task group finally entered Port Royal Bay, Bermuda. The submarine was immediately hidden inside a restricted section of the naval base. She was repainted to disguise her German markings. Her new designation became USS Nemo. The German prisoners were transported to a secret prison camp in Louisiana. The Red Cross was denied access. Their families in Germany were informed that they were missing at sea. They would not learn the truth until 1947, when Admiral Ernest King, commander of the United States Fleet, reviewed the intelligence captured aboard U-505. He understood its enormous value, but he also recognized the risk Captain Gallery had taken. If the operation had failed, or if the Germans had discovered the capture, the consequences could have been severe. Gallery received the Legion of Merit, but he also received a private warning. The success of the mission now depended on one thing above all else. The secret had to hold. If the secret failed, there would be consequences. But it didn't fail. The German Navy never learned what truly happened to U-505. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, received the submarine's last transmission on June 3, 1944. It reported a position off the West African coast and indicated it was returning to its base at Lorient, France. After June 4th, there was only silence. And in 1944, silence was normal. U-boats vanished constantly. Allied hunter-killer groups and long-range aircraft had turned the Atlantic into a killing ground. Donitz assumed U-505 had been sunk like hundreds before it. So he ordered no code changes, no emergency warnings, no shift in Enigma procedures. The Kriegsmarine continued using the same settings, the same cipher habits, the same operational patterns. The secrecy held. More than 3,000 American sailors had witnessed the capture, and not one of them talked. No letters home describing aborted U-boat. No diary entries. No loose rumors in ports. Captain Daniel Gallery had explained the stakes during the tow to Bermuda. If the Germans discovered the truth, the intelligence value would vanish, and Allied sailors would die because someone couldn't keep quiet. The men understood. Not a single breach occurred. Within weeks, the captured materials reached Bletchley Park in England. British codebreakers had been fighting German naval encryption for years. They had cracked parts of it, but the Germans changed settings frequently, and even small mistakes could plunge Allied analysts back into darkness. U-505 changed everything. The Enigma machines confirmed methods. The codebooks delivered current settings. Messages that had been meaningless suddenly became readable. Submarine patrol zones. Rendezvous points. Attack plans. Supply routes. The Atlantic, once an ocean of uncertainty, became an ocean with outlines. Convoy commanders altered routes to avoid known U-boat concentrations. Hunter-killer groups were directed to precise search areas instead of sweeping blindly. The advantage was not dramatic in the way a battle was dramatic. It was quiet, mathematical, and deadly. The captured acoustic homing torpedoes mattered just as much. American engineers at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory disassembled the weapons and identified what made them terrifying. The torpedoes listened for propeller cavitation noise, the sound signature of a ship moving through water. Once the problem was understood, countermeasures followed. Allied ships began towing noisemakers, decoys designed to produce louder sounds than the ship itself. The torpedoes chased the decoy, not the ship. German commanders soon reported that their acoustic torpedoes were missing with alarming frequency. Donitz suspected the enemy had developed a countermeasure, but he never connected it to U-505. He assumed the Allies had recovered a torpedo that failed to detonate. He did not realize they had captured an entire submarine intact. The Battle of the Atlantic continued into late 1944. Germany introduced snorkels that allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, making them harder to detect. But the Allies now had something better than guesswork. They had the codes. They often knew where the new submarines were heading before they arrived. The ocean hunt became increasingly one-sided. Losses mounted. By the time Allied armies were pushing into Germany in 1945, the Atlantic War, once the most dangerous front, was effectively decided. Pillsbury returned to Norfolk for repairs. The collision during the capture had flooded compartments and battered her hull, but within weeks she was operational again. By late summer she was back at sea. And she wasn't done. Because even as Germany's Reich collapsed, the German Navy still planned one last operation, a desperate attempt to strike the American coastline. Operation Teardrop. In early April 1945, Allied intelligence detected a group of German submarines crossing the Atlantic toward the west. The boats were long-range types capable of reaching the American coast. But what terrified planners wasn't simply torpedoes. It was rumor. For months, intelligence officers had heard reports that Germany might attempt something unthinkable, launching V-1 flying bombs, or even V-2 rockets from submarine platforms. Those weapons had devastated London. One striking New York or Washington could kill thousands. No one could confirm the threat, but no one could dismiss it. So the Navy built a barrier. A net. A wall of ships and aircraft. Task Group 22-7, including escort carriers and destroyer escorts, spread across the Atlantic approaches. Pillsbury was assigned to the screen. For 2 weeks they patrolled in fog and heavy seas. Aircraft flying constant searches, sonar operators listening into the gray depths. The submarines were out there somewhere, running silent under the swells. On April 16th, the barrier scored its first successes. 2 German submarines were located and destroyed in quick succession. Days later, another was sunk. The system worked. But the Germans kept coming. On the morning of April 24, 1945, the destroyer escort USS Frederick C. Davis was patrolling roughly 650 miles northwest of the Azores when her sonar operator called out a contact. A submarine was trying to slip through. Davis maneuvered to attack. The contact faded in her wake. The officer of the deck ordered a hard turn to regain it. And then, at close range, a torpedo struck. An acoustic homing weapon detonated in the forward engine room. The explosion broke the ship nearly in half. The bow section sank almost immediately. The stern floated only minutes as survivors scrambled into the freezing water. 115 men died. Only 77 were rescued. Frederick C. Davis became the last American warship sunk by enemy action in the Atlantic. The submarine responsible was U-546, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Paul Just. She had slipped through the barrier long enough to deliver a point-blank kill. Now she dove deep and ran silent. Pillsbury was about 12 miles away when the distress call came. Castleman ordered flank speed. Within an hour, destroyer escorts converged on the datum point. Sonar contact came first, then faded. Depth charges rolled off stern racks. Hedgehog mortars fired patterns of spiked bombs. U-546 dove hard, 600 feet, hiding beneath thermal layers, drifting on electric motors, the crew fighting for time. The hunt lasted hour after hour. Each attack forced the submarine deeper. Each evasion burned battery power. Inside the U-boat, air grew foul. Men grew exhausted. And the math tightened. No air. No batteries. No escape. By late afternoon, U-546 was nearly spent. After a final Hedgehog attack, the submarine blew ballast and broke the surface. American ships opened fire instantly. Machine guns raked the deck. The German captain launched 2 torpedoes in a last act of defiance. Both missed. The crew abandoned ship. 33 survivors were pulled from the water, including Captain Just himself. He was taken aboard the escort carrier Bogue for interrogation. And once again, the U.S. Navy proved it could do more than destroy submarines. It could hunt them, corner them, and strip them of secrets. Because in this war, the most valuable weapon was not always a bomb or a torpedo. Sometimes it was information. And it started, quietly, on the day a boarding party climbed onto a slick, circling deck and refused to let a German submarine sink.